Hello YouTubers, and welcome to this review on the new Keysight 3000T series oscilloscopes. Now in this review, we're not just going to review the Keysight 3000T series by itself, because its nearest competitor is the Tektronix MDO3000 series oscilloscope. If you do any research on either of these scopes, there's a very good chance in each of their data sheets you're going to see a comparison where they are compared against each other. Each of the manufacturers are going to highlight their strengths versus the other weaknesses and vice versa. In this review, I hope to highlight some of the differences between these two scopes. I don't think there's necessarily one which is an outright leader. I think it depends on your application, what you're doing. Some of them have their strengths and tool sets which might work better for your application versus the other. The Keysight has gone a long way to improve its feature set and its capabilities. It's now got touch screen, which actually adds a lot of value to it and makes it very easy to use. However, it still has shortcomings in terms of the amount of memory that it has, and that if we're comparing it against the Tektronix, it doesn't have a dedicated spectrum analyzer. However, it does now have FFT gating, which means you've got some time correlation between your time domain and your frequency domain, and you can compare digital signals as well. As noted, the MDO3000 does have a dedicated RF input to a spectrum analyzer, so it has a fair bit of functionality in terms of that, but there's no time correlation. You need to step up to the 4000 series to get time correlation between your different signal types. The MDO3000 also has a bigger display and screen area than the 3000T series from Keysight. However, the Keysight, even though the gradical area is smaller, it allows a portion of the display to be used to show measurements. Whereas when you do that on the Tektronix, you'll be overlapping the display. That will also happen on the Keysight. Once you're adding certain measurement features, they'll also overlap the display, but it does have that dedicated area for some measurement display at the expense of a smaller gradical area. The Tektronix comes with 10 meg memory depth, whereas the Keysight comes with 4 meg. However, it does not come with segmented memory, which is a standard option. Both of these models, which are sitting at the 1 GHz bandwidth, sample at 5 gigasamples per second. That 5 gigasamples per second is right through the range on the Keysight, whereas on the lower models of the Tektronix, that drops to 2.5 gigasamples per second. For both of these scopes, you're going to start paying extra for additional software applications. They range anywhere in price from $150 right up to $1,500 or more. The Tektronix comes with a digital voltmeter included when you register it. On the Keysight, you're going to pay $150 for that, a hardware frequency counter and a totalizer. The Tektronix includes LAN and VGA in the price, whereas you're going to pay an extra $400 to $450 for the LAN and VGA option on the Keysight. The price of these two scopes behind me without the software options is around $15,500. The Keysight, as it's optioned here, costs about $18,400, and that's because they provide an option where you can get all those software options for about $2,700. So if you're going to choose one or two more options, it's worthwhile going for that $2,700 option, but that's pricey. Both of these start their entry-level models, that being the 100 MHz model without the digital signal input, 2 channels, at $3,350, both at the same price. For these models, once you start getting up to 1 GHz bandwidth, you are paying for both of them $9,900 just to have that bandwidth. So we certainly want to make sure that that bandwidth works reasonably well. In this review, we obviously want to highlight the new features and see how well the new Keysight works, but for some of the demonstrations, I'll be comparing it to the Tektronix MDO3000. Now, the other key performance feature to note between these two is the waveform updates, and that is certainly based around their computing architecture. The Tektronix relies on more traditional computing architecture, while the Keysight has got its own custom ASICs to help it perform very well. The Keysight can deliver over 1 million waveform updates per second, while the Tektronix does about 280,000 waveform updates per second in its fast acquisition mode. Although there are some compromises that need to be noted when it is running in that fast acquisition mode, which we'll look at once we get to the bench. Now, we'll do a full summary once we get to the end of this review, but in my humble opinion, if either of these manufacturers don't take the next big leap forward in terms of their shortcomings currently, they'll leave themselves in the dust. There are many other cheaper scopes out there which are providing reasonably good performance, good memory depth at a very good price point. So if Agilent don't do some more work and enhance the memory and perhaps get a later ASIC, or in particular if Tektronix don't work on their performance, then they are going to be left back in the dust in the next iteration or models that they release to the public. In terms of physical layout, both of the units sit at about the same height. In terms of width, the Tektronix is slightly wider. That is due to the physically bigger screen and display area, and then the extra piece for the dedicated spectrum analyzer. The physical layout of the Keysight or Agilent has always worked well for me. They've always had a very nice feel to the controls. They've got a nice rubberized grip and a nice tactile feel. All the knobs have a secondary function that you can click on to either center something or go into fine mode. For the volts per division, you can adjust and push to go to fine mode. Likewise, you can do that for the horizontal control as well. Really nice features to have. On the Tektronix, they do that for the volts per division, but not for your time base on the horizontal. The Keysight now has a dedicated button for the serial bus, and then a button to enable or disable the touch screen. It now has a dedicated button for FFT, and a second maths function that you can bring up on the screen as well. It has an arbitrary waveform generator output. This is an optional extra, but is included on the Tektronix scope. You then have your digital channels, a USB input, your probe compensation or demonstration waveforms, and then your 4 channels. The Tektronix also has a very nice tactile feel to the knobs when you adjust them. Even though it's not contrasted, it does have a nice rubber grip to them. As noted, a secondary push for many of the buttons, but not the horizontal control. It does have very nice controls for the wave inspector, which we'll demonstrate into the review. So you can inspect and zoom into a wave of interest. It then does have these multi-purpose rotary knobs that you can pull up to go through menu selections. I have found that sometimes that can be a bit fiddly. You click for an option, it comes up on the screen and you kind of don't know where to grab to. That's very subjective. I'm sure someone that's been using the Tektronix for a while has become very accustomed and probably enjoys that functionality. On the right side, we've got all the controls which are dedicated to the spectrum analyzer with its dedicated RF input. It also has a USB input, and the digital channels are contained behind this little flap which conceals the digital input plug. Both oscilloscopes are equipped with carry handles. The Keysight has a small carry handle, whereas the Tektronix has a nice long robust carry handle. It also allows you to flip it back to provide more stability for the unit when it's tilted up on its front feet. Both units have feet at the front. And these will provide a better viewing angle if they are on a bench next to you. On the back of the Keysight we can see the fan, which is actually very quiet during operation. It's then got the option for the LAN and VGA, which as I noted is an optional extra. You pay between $400 and $450 for that. The power input is international, so anywhere from 100 volts to 240 volts, 50 or 60 hertz. It then also has USB device and host inputs, as well as a trigger out and an external trigger in. The Keysight does incorporate a nice handy little cubby hole if you want to store your probes. It holds a pair of probes with no issue, but I imagine getting 4 probes into here is going to be a bit of a squeeze. At the back of the Tektronix we've got our fan, which again is reasonably quiet. We've got our arbitrary function generator output, which is on the back this time as opposed to the front of the unit like the Keysight. We've got an auxiliary out, which can act as our trigger out. We've got our LAN, our VGA, and then our 2 USB device and host inputs and outputs. It then also has a universal power in, which goes from 100 to 240 volts, 50 to 60 hertz. The other little feature that I forgot to mention on the front of the Tektronix is this little port over here. There's a little doorway, and you can put a little key in here which can contain a software license. So if you buy one of the optional software licenses, you merely insert the key in here. That gets loaded permanently into the scope, and then you can remove that key. The Agilent is supplied with the N2843A probe. It's a 500 MHz probe at 10 megaohm and 11 picofarad. These probes are right through the range of a scopes, and if you do want probes which are going to be more capable in terms of going up to the bandwidth of 1 GHz, you seriously need to consider moving from passive to active probes. The little bag of accessories provides you with some tips, some shorter earthing leads, a compensation probe, and your color identification tabs. The Tektronix is supplied with a TPP1000 probe. It's a 1 GHz, 3.9 picofarad, 10 mega ohm probe. Just be warned that once you are going above 500 megahertz, it's still advisable to seriously consider a set of active probes. There are numerous challenges with trying to probe a high bandwidth signal with a passive probe. In the little accessories bag, you'll find another tip, the shorter earthing leads, and the coloring tags. Tektronix also supplies some nice probing points that if you're trying to attach to ICs, it'll make your life easier. This means the probe tip is set into a nice gripper to grip onto an IC leg, as well as your earthing lead has got a gripping point. The Tektronix does not have a compensation screwdriver, as that's all done within the scope. The Keysight does part of that in the scope, but if the setting is too far out, it'll ask you to make adjustments with the adjustment screwdriver. If you purchase the mixed signal option on any of these scopes, you'll then get a set of digital probes to look at logic signals. With a Keysight, although it's labeled Agilent, you'll get the N2756A probe set. They are provided with these nice little grippers, and each of the digital probes or connectors has got its own ground. You can connect the little supplied cable and connect a gripper to each of these. The Tektronix only has 4 ground leads across all 16 inputs, and in some situations, particularly in noisy environments, you may want more grounding, in which case the Agilent set of probes will have that advantage. To keep the probes tidy, which you aren't using, Agilent or Keysight provide a little header connector where you connect the probes that you're not using onto that to keep them out of the way. Tektronix supply you with a P6316 logic probe for the 16 channels. I really prefer this connector type that they provide. It makes it very easy to connect to the scope. They then provide you with all the grippers for the 16 channels. On the probe side, they allow you to actually disconnect the channels which you're not using, which can be quite handy so that you don't get too much of a mess as opposed to clipping the probe tips onto a header. Here are the leads of 8 of the channels, and as I noted, here you've got 2 earth leads, as opposed to where you can have an earth lead on every single channel on the Keysight digital probes. Both of these oscilloscopes can take a little while to boot up and get up and running. I don't think that's an issue for anyone who's got them switched on all day at their desk, but anyway, we'll just do a side by side and see what the stopwatch says. The Tektronix does it in about 45 seconds. And the Keysight does it in about 1 minute and 5 seconds. The big feature on the new Keysight, denoted by the T, is the touch screen. This now allows you a lot of flexibility in terms of controlling what's going on. You've got a menu system up here, or the start menu, where you've got a very tablet-like display where you can control the operation of the oscilloscope, run, stop, trigger, measure. In fact, these settings, if you have a tablet, you can control this scope remotely from a tablet. This touchscreen allows you to move some informational menus around this display. These can also be set so that they are either solid or transparent. In their transparent form, you can see the signal behind them. And if they go to their solid, then it occupies the forefront of the display. It also allows you control and movement of the waveforms on the display. I can move that up. If I bring in channel 2, I can move those around. The channel which is active has got a block highlighted. So there we've got channel 2 active. If I go to 1, you can see the block there is highlighted. You also have the option to go and set triggers, a trigger zone. You can set it to move the waveform or to create a zone. I can use my finger and create a trigger zone, which we'll demonstrate a little later in the review. Once you have options enabled, you can then go and click on the bottom here. As opposed to hitting the soft buttons at the bottom of the display, you can now touch the screen and enable or switch off certain options. The one thing I will note, you've got this little icon over here which acts as your back button, so you don't have to use the back button, but it is really squeezed into the corner, so you almost feel as though you're squeezing your finger into the corner to hit it. If you don't, you're likely to hit the icon right next to it. I imagine Keysight have got these all spaced out correctly for the font size and everything else, but if they could adjust these slightly smaller and give that a bit more room, that would make things a little bit easier to hit it. Adding something like measurements to the display becomes very easy now. You can simply click on the free space, choose what you want, whether it's cursors, measurements, or whether you want to navigate. I can go to measurements. I've then got the measurements that I've already selected down here. I can go and obviously change the source. I can go add additional measurements. And those will appear on the side here, and you can have up to 8 measurements down the side of the display. So really, really nice. And as noted, the graticule area on the Keysight is smaller, but it does allow the space on the side here for information that doesn't cross over or overlap on your signal area. You may find sometimes that you're either hitting the screen in mistake if you're trying to point things out, or you just don't want to use a touch feature. Then you simply hit the touch button to disable it, and then you come to a normal scope control. To switch it back on, it thinks for a little bit, and then it's enabled again. The Tektronix has a larger display of the two oscilloscopes. They're both still 10 by 8, but it is physically larger, although it doesn't have any dedicated area to provide space for if you've got measurement or other information up on the display. The critical information is displayed down here and doesn't get in the way of the signal. One thing to note, it'll show you your sample rate, as does the Keysight, but it'll also show you your memory depth. You do have the option on the Tektronix to set your record length by selecting between 1000, 10K, 100K, 1 meg, 5 meg, and 10 meg. I do wish they did have an auto option. On the Keysight, you don't have this manual option. Everything is optimized to give you the best performance. I can certainly see the value of being able to adjust your memory length, but it would be nice to have an auto feature as well. This is something that the Regol's got. Once we start adding something, let's say like measurement values, we'll see how that takes up real estate where the signal is displayed. And there's something else I want to highlight. If I go to measure, what I found myself doing was wanting to now touch the screen on the Tektronix. And that's part because I've just come across from, let's say, the Keysight where you can touch the screen. But the other thing is just it's very intuitive to be able to hit these controls. And the reason I highlight that is sometimes over here, if I go to add measurement on the Tektronix, you're now thrown up, you have to read the screen and then realize that you're now going to go to your two multi-purpose dials over here. So you have to realize which one you're going to use to make the selection. Whereas if this was touch screen, I'd just simply touch the screen without even thinking that I've got to now go across from here to make that adjustment. As I've said, anyone who's using this oscilloscope day to day is probably going to find that very natural to them. However, I still find it a bit of a quirk reaching round for these controls, and touch would be very nice in this instance. If I now go and add some of those measurements, I'll take the menu off. We can see the amount of real estate that's been taken off. I need to switch the menu off again. And then our measurements are now sitting at the bottom of where the signal would be displayed. So that's consuming some real estate, so that's the compromise. You get a bigger display area, but when you start putting things like measurements on the display, you don't have a dedicated area as you do on the Keysight. It's occupying real estate where your signal could possibly be displayed. If we take a quick look at the test signal to confirm whether the amplitude is within calibration, it should be 3 volt peak to peak, and with the measurement, certainly close enough. Now checking the time base, we've got the test signal set to 200 microseconds per division, and those steps match up perfectly with the time-based graticule, so no problem there. The test signal on the Tektronix for the amplitude measurement, check that, 3 volts exactly, so no problem there. Looking at the time base, again at 200 microseconds per division, the steps are perfectly in line, so no problem on the Tektronix. Looking at the noise floor on these oscilloscopes, I've got both of them set to the same time base and volts per division and termination. Having a look at the average figures, because they're the better ones to go by, if we look at the peak to peak, that is sitting at 2.64 millivolts, and the AC RMS is sitting at 272 microvolts. On the Tektronix, the peak to peak is sitting at an average of 1.79 and 188 micro, as opposed to the 272 versus the 2.64 on the Keysight. Now, something to be aware of here is that the Tektronix, when it's at the 1 volt per division, so this is the lowest voltage scale, does employ some bandwidth limiting. Now, prior to this review, I updated the Tektronix to the latest firmware. I noticed that that bandwidth limitation had been raised. Previously at 1 millivolt per division, this had a bandwidth limit of about 150 or so, a little above 150 megahertz. That has now been lifted, as we'll see when we do the bandwidth tests. But that would account for why these figures are lower, because the bandwidth limiting, there's less noise coming into the front end. I'm going to take it up to 10 millivolts on both scopes, because at that point the Tektronix has no bandwidth limiting. Before I do make the adjustment to the 10 millivolt scale, I just want to note this is normal acquisition. If I go to the acquire mode and change that to high resolution, we then go from 8 bits to 12 bits as I recall, and that will certainly change the noise level. Of course, you've also got averaging as well if you want to improve things. The scope's adjusted now to 10 millivolts per division. If we have a look at the averages, the peak to peak is sitting at 3.14 millivolts, and the AC RMS is sitting at 320 microvolts. On the Tech with the same settings, 10 millivolt per division, we can see our averages here is 4.98 versus the 3.12 that was on the Keysight, and the 458 microvolts versus the 320 on the Keysight. So when we're comparing apples to apple with the bandwidth all open, the Keysight certainly seems to have the edge on the noise levels. In terms of performance, I've got a 500 megahertz sine wave coming into both of the oscilloscopes. I'm using the built-in hardware frequency counter to give us a waveform updates through the trigger out. So the Keysight is giving us over 1 million waveform updates per second, which is what it's quoted as doing. Also, what I want you to note is that it can go down to 500 picoseconds for the time base. Here is the same sine wave coming into the Tektronix. The Tektronix goes up to 400 picoseconds for its time base. The performance of the Tektronix is interesting. So here I've got a multimeter showing us it's doing 2.2 thousand, so 2,200 waveform updates per second. Now this is in its normal acquisition mode. It does have a high speed acquisition mode, which I'm going to switch it to now. On the Tektronix, if we go to the acquire menu, and I enable fast acquisition. Now just note, I've already set the record length down to 1,000 to give it the best opportunity for the speed at the same time base. So you can see in comparison to the Keysight with the fast acquisition off, it's a lot slower. It doesn't have the dedicated ASICs or the custom ASICs that Keysight have put into their MSO series or their 3000 series, but it does have fast acquisition. I'll switch that on. Something I want you to note before we get there, in the wave display, I'm going to switch the persistence off. Then if I go back into fast acquisition, I just switch that on. You can see it goes up to 285,000 waveform updates per second. And if we go and have a look at the waveform display, by default it switches persistence on. You cannot switch it off. Now you'll notice in the background the shape of the waveform. If I go and switch the fast acquisition off, it appears normal again. I've seen when Dave Jones was also demonstrating like this, it does this peculiar waveform. I'm not sure why it does that. If we change the time base, we can get it to the point where the waveform is looking a little more normal, but I'm not sure what that kind of anomaly is. Again, if I switch the fast acquisition off, the waveform looks kind of more normal than with the kind of stripes that it does now. When you get down to that level, you're looking at about 281,000 waveform updates, which is a lot less than the Keysight. There is another quirk that you need to note on the Tektronix, that when you are in the fast acquisition mode, there's a limitation in terms of, let's say, enabling some measurements. While in the fast acquisition mode on the Tektronix, if I wish to go and add a measurement, if I go add and then click OK to add, you'll see it pops up with this message, settings conflict, set fast acquisition to off in order to use a selected feature. Now I'm not too sure how many features that applies to, but certainly it does with the measurements. So if I want to go and add a measurement now, I have to go menu off, go to acquire, switch off the fast acquisition, then I can go to measure, add a measurement, and it's added it in the background. So just something to note on the Tektronix. the Keysight also has an interesting quirk of its own that I demonstrated in a previous video. It has its analog to digital converters and its ASICs paired behind channel 1 and 2. So channel 1 and 2 has its own dedicated ASIC and an analog to digital converter, and likewise across 3 and 4 has its own ASIC and an analog to digital converter. Now those analog to digital converters are running at 5 gigasamples per second, so if you enable channel 1 and 2 together, it has to drop to 2.5 gigasamples per second. Now I'll just demonstrate that. Also note the performance. So over here you can see the waveforms as I've got the time base set is around about 816,000 waveform updates per second. We're currently at 5 gigasamples per second. When I enable channel 2, that drops to 2.5, and then our performance, our waveform update, almost halves to 400,000 updates per second. If you want to retain that performance and you only need 2 channels, you need to use channels 1 and 3, and then you retain your sample rate and your performance. However, it should be noted that looking at the performance of the Tektronix, even if you've got these 2 channels enabled, the performance is still going to be way more than you get with the Tektronix. Now with the Tektronix, you'll note at the moment for the time base, it's got 5 gigasamples per second. I've got it in its fast acquisition mode, so we're sitting at 281,000 waveform updates per second. If I switch on channel 2, that performance stays the same in terms of the waveform updates, and the sample rate is still sitting at 5. I can switch, if I obviously go to 3, it then needs to halve, the performance drops. Note, not a big performance drop, but this is because it's not using a dedicated ASIC, it's using more traditional computing power. But I can then have channel 1 and 3, I still have the performance, or I can go to channel 1 and 4. So on the Tektronix, you can have any 2 channels on and you'll retain your best performance until you go to 3. Whereas obviously on the Keysight, it's very specific in terms of if you want the performance, you need to go to 1 and 3. Hopefully in the future, this is something that Tektronix will work on. They have a wonderful scope, but they do need to do something about their performance levels. They need to perhaps consider going the ASIC route where they can improve the waveform updates without the funny quirks which you get with the fast acquire. Next, we're going to check the input bandwidth of both these scopes. Now remember, I noted that a big part of the cost for these devices is in that input bandwidth, $9,900. So what I have got, I specifically gone and purchased a high quality low loss cable. This cable at about 1 gigahertz loses about 0.6 dB, and I'll just show you the specs from the place that I purchased it. I've gone and double checked that on my Agilent signal generator and then on the Agilent vector spectrum analyzer. I've also used the spectrum analyzer on the Tektronix scope and verified for one that loss is correct. Also that the signal that's coming out of my spectrum analyzer is flat, that's not incurring any losses as it moves up towards 1 gigahertz. For this measurement, we're going to go at the 1 millivolt per division scale and the 10 millivolt per division scale. The reason for the 1 is that potentially we know that the Tektronix has issues with signals at that level where they limit the bandwidth. So that's why we're testing that. I know their limit, I think, goes up to about 5 millivolts. The next test after this one will be at 10, when both of them don't have any bandwidth limitation. As far as we know, the Keysight doesn't limit the bandwidth. What we want to check is the attenuation of the signal. It can go to minus 3 dB once we start getting up to 1 gigahertz. So with this signal at 5 millivolt, it could attenuate. The 3 dB mark is going to be about 3.5 millivolt. We can see there's a lot of noise on the signal, so what we are going to do, we are going to put both scopes into high resolution, or not high resolution, averaging. And then we get a nice, reasonably stable signal, which we're able to measure reasonably easy on the side here. So at 1 megahertz, and we've got our 5 millivolt amplitude signal. So next we're at 100 megahertz, and the amplitude is dropped a little bit. We're at 150, 200, 300, 600. Now I have noted that the amplitude has come up a bit, and that I believe is due to the standing wave ratio. There's some reactance, some capacitance at the entry to the scope. So you are going to have a standing wave which will alter as we go through the frequency range. 900, and we're sitting very close to our original 1 gigahertz. Now what I'm going to do, you can see it's dropped a little bit. I'm going to add the 0.6 dB to cater for the loss in the cable, so we're removing the loss that's in the cable. And there we go. So I've done that, and I'm just going to note this figure. We're right back up to around 4.8. We're jumping around a bit, but I'm going to note about 4.8. That's slightly overreading because there's this little extra kind of lobe which is a bit higher. So I'll tell you what, I'll take it about 4.7. So this is nowhere near the 3.5 millivolts, which it could have dropped to. So in terms of the input bandwidth at the 1 millivolt scale on the Keysight, it's doing very well indeed. Same thing on the Tektronix, 1 millivolt per division. I've got the same impedance, 50 ohm on both of them for this. I'm going to switch on averaging, clean things up on the measurement. I'm just going to reset the statistics. I must say the nice thing is that the Tektronix does give you a mean value straight up for the measurement, which does make life a little bit easier. But there we go. So this one's starting off a little lower at 4.8 volts, let's call it, or 4.9. I've noted that, and if need be, I'll cater for that. I don't know why this is starting at a lower voltage, but we'll cater for it if need be. So that's 100 megahertz, so that would still be within spec. I'm going to step it up manually from this point. We're at 200. Now at this point, I'll just note previously, and you can see something a bit queer going on there. At 200, this would have fallen over. There would have been no signal. I'm not sure that's the averaging that's making that look a bit odd. Let's just pull some of that off. Dial it down so it's a bit faster. 300. 300, we're very close to the 3 dB point. We're at an average of about 3.7. 400, and I think this lobe, I'm not sure why this lobe is there. So let's go and take a manual measurement. Our delta here is down to 2.3 millivolts if we look at the main amplitude. So I'm just going to drop the frequency. What I've done, I've just set the cursors where it should be at the 3.5. That's a 3 dB cutoff. That's the averaging, which is making the wave look a bit squirrely. So there's where we get our 3 dB cutoff, roughly at about 200 megahertz. Now, as I said, that's up from what it previously was at about 150. It would fall over, but the latest firmware seems to have changed that. I don't know whether by design, but I've certainly seen the difference. So just a note, when you're putting in a small signal, 1 millivolt per division, you're going to have bandwidth limiting on the Tektronix. I'm not sure the reason why they do it, whether it's noise. It'll be interesting to see if someone like Alan or someone from Tektronix can comment, but you're not going to get your 1 gigahertz input with a smaller signal. So let's move to 10 millivolt division. Now starting off with an amplitude of 50 millivolts. We're on the 10 millivolt per division setting on the scope at the top here. I'm going to go up fairly quickly. I'm going to go straight up to 500 megahertz. We're sitting at 43. We could go down to 35.3 and still be at our minus 3 dB point. Now I'm going to jump straight up to 1 gig. So there's 1 gig and we're sitting at 45. I'm going to now add in the loss of the 0.6 dB, and that brings us up to 48. So that's very close to what we started at. So again, in terms of the usable bandwidth and not losing much on the amplitude, the Keysight's doing very well. This time the Tektronix is spot on, so it's measuring 50 millivolt, and we're on the 10 millivolt per division scale. Now we're going to jump off, that's at 1 megahertz, we're going to jump up to 500 megahertz. And here at 500 megahertz, it's sitting at 46.6, so certainly no issue there. Now we're up to 1 gigahertz, and we're sitting at 35. So let's just note that. Now we'll cater for the loss. So catering for the loss in the cable brings us about up to 37, I'll call it 37. So at this point there was a full 10 millivolt difference between the Keysight and the Tektronix, so there certainly seems to be a bit more attenuation on the Tektronix, but at least it is getting up to the 1 gigahertz for the minus 3 dB loss. But the Keysight certainly seems to do that with no issue at all, with not too much attenuation on the signal. I'll include a test of the probes. This can be, I will with a caveat that testing probes can be rather challenging. There can be lots of things along the way which can mess up a measurement, but for the most part I've got the low loss cable, I've got the barrel connection, so we've got it going directly in. We haven't got a lead which is going to play a part. These are rated for 500 megahertz. I'm going to start off with a 100 millivolt amplitude signal which is coming in at 1 megahertz. So that can drop to, if we're going back to the minus 3 dB mark, can drop to 70.7 millivolt. I'm going to take it straight up to 500 megahertz. And at 500 megahertz, it's sitting at over 73 millivolts. So it's certainly within the 3 dB point. So no problem with it operating at 500. For fun, I'm going to take it up to 1 gig. And there we go. At 1 gig, you can see these fall over. But certainly up to 500, they seem to do the job. Got the same setup with the Tektronix probe. Remember, this one should go to 1 gigahertz. I've also especially done a compensation without the hood and with the short earth lead to make sure the compensation is as best as it can be, because that can certainly play a part in these tests. The amplitude of our 100 millivolt signal is sitting at 95, again, when I put it into the Tektronix. So what I'm going to do to make life easier, I'm going to up that just so we've got a 100 millivolt signal to start with. There we go, so we're at 100 millivolts, and I'm going to jump straight to 500 megahertz. Now at 500 megahertz, remember the minus 3 dB cutoff would be at 70.7 millivolt, and we're down to 65. So, as I said, testing probes like this, there could be lots of things which could be causing this. The way I've got things set up, I've done it as best as I can, the same way in which I did the Keysight, but here at 500 megahertz, it's below the 3 dB cutoff point. I have just taken it up to 1 gigahertz. All I can assume is that with the losses that we saw on the input to the Tektronix, just using a cable, those losses combined with some of the losses I presume in the scope probe means that this is struggling to cater for the bandwidth that it's quoted for. And just before we end off on kind of testing the bandwidth of the Tektronix, I went back and I put in a larger amplitude signal just to make sure we weren't hitting the issues related to the bandwidth being cut off at the volts per division, because now with the probe, remember it's a 10-to-1 probe. So I put in a bigger signal. Here we've got it. We're sitting at 1 gigahertz, and I'm going to change the volts per division. Now this time it's not going to go down to 1 volt per division, it's going to go down to 10 volts per division because of the 10-to-1 probe. So there we go. I'm at 50 volts per division. As we expect, the signal looks bigger. I go to 20, it looks bigger, and now I go to the last setting of 10, bang. And that's where obviously now with the 10-to-1 probe, they've got bandwidth limiting, and literally the signal disappears. If I come bring it back to the 20 millivolt scale, then we've got the signal back. Looking at some of the other features on the Keysight, I've just pulled up the frequency, the normal frequency measurement on the display. It does have, I noted one of the options you can get for $150 is where you get a frequency counter, digital voltmeter, and totalizer. So if we go and enable the counter, I'll just pull it down so it's less digits, so it also takes a while to come up, but it is a proper hardware counter. Now, even if what I'm going to do, I'm going to go and run stop the signal. So at the moment the signal is stopped, and if I go and change the frequency, you'll see the frequency over here changes. So these utilities, the counter, the digital voltmeter, are not bound by the trigger. They just merely look at the output and do their stuff. So in this case, the frequency counter is obviously looking at the frequency at the input. I'll just put the signal to run again. We'll change this from 5 digits all the way up to 8. It takes a little bit of time to calculate it. I've just gone and made a change on my signal generator, so we'll just let it settle. And I'm supposed to be putting out 300 kilohertz, and I believe that my signal generator could be slightly out. I've got nothing really to verify down to this level. But the one thing I will note, I'm going to now make a change at that last digit. So I've changed the last digit by 1. And there we go, this has picked up that change. So certainly as a counter down to the last digit, when you've got 8 digits displayed, it certainly seems fairly accurate and sensitive enough to pick up those changes. The next feature they've got also is the digital voltmeter. Now I'll just demonstrate that. Now the one thing I wanted to highlight, this does have bandwidth limits. You can see it's got the display there, greater bandwidth. You've basically exceeded the bandwidth limit. This can only work between 20 Hertz and 100 kilohertz. I'll just drop the frequency. I've dropped it to 50 kilohertz. And now we can see that you've also got this digital voltmeter, which also does auto ranging, which is really handy. If I go back to the counter, if you click on that, you then come up with the option to set either frequency period or totalize. So you can select totalize, and now it's counting triggered events. And again, this, if I push the run stop, we'll just note the signal has stopped at the top here. That'll still totalize. So again, it's not tied to the trigger, which is really great. Another feature set here is the power application. And here you can go and measure all kinds of things. Power quality, harmonics, inrush. There are a whole slew of things. Now, as you know, I enjoy power measurement, but unfortunately we don't have time to kind of test this out in this review. Keysight will be putting a 100 megahertz scope into my hands with these feature sets enabled. So in a future video we will go through these and put it through its paces, because these could be really, really handy as long as you've got the right probes and kit to do the measurements. One of the options that you can buy for the scope, I'm just pushing the help button, is a training facility. So if we go down here and look at, let's say for instance, training signals, we can click on that. It explains how to set up your probes. You go and connect your probes to channel 1 and 2, and then to your 2 training signals or demo signals out at the bottom here. And then this will go and take you through a whole series of tests, and it'll guide you through setting up these test signals so that you can learn how to trigger on them correctly. It'll show you pulses and glitches, and end up really being a great, helpful training facility. This is an optional extra, so you just need to be wary of that. I'm going to be using an external board to demonstrate some of the next features on this, because I don't want to be bound by perhaps the settings that are in here. And then I can demonstrate that across both the scopes.